All righty, it is 3 o'clock, and I am going live for those who are able to join us today. Today we are being joined by Eric, and Eric, you do not have to come off camera, you don't have to come off mute. I just want to acknowledge my live audience that is on the Zoom with me today. And again, the purposes of these lives is a way for me to organize the class so I can make sure that I'm posting on a regular basis about the topics that you're reading about each week. So you can interact or jump in or ask a question during the live if you so choose. You can leave, you can come back. Um, this is it's up to you. I want y'all to treat it just like you would treat alive on Facebook if you are of Facebooking age. So, welcome, welcome. Just getting our little slideshow together so that we can all see it when I post these later. This is week 2. Share it. And I'm going to share my screen. No, what just happened? Oh, it's not sharing though. Okay, let's see. Why is it not sharing? Oh, there it is. All right. So, yeah, I like doing it like this because then it's easier for me to get everything out that needs to get out in a timely manner. And you all aren't waiting around for me to post, and you can engage in it. You don't have to. There's no homework. There's no discussion that you have to engage with before you watch these videos. Sometimes the videos can help frame it. So yeah, I think this is a good way of doing this. So this week in this first module, we're talking about history of U.S. schools and U.S. school administration. So hopefully you all have done the introduction on the second, I think it was like the second announcement where you tell people who you are. Some of you all I've had before, like Eric, I think I've had you before. And some of you all, you're new to me, but sometimes you're new to each other as well. So I want to make sure that y'all are introducing yourselves to one another. Everyone, I believe, has completed the first article analysis. So I'm going through that this week. Thank you so much for the timeliness of it. I'll give you some feedback. You can adjust your second one according to the feedback. I'll try to get that out to you before tomorrow so you can have it in a timely manner. And yeah, so far everything is just rolling along. This week you should be watching. There's not so much reading, it's just one article to read, and you should be watching the history of the U.S. schools, the history of American public education. Um, it is a 4-part series. That means it's about 4 hours. You can watch it at your leisure. I'm not asking you to like take notes on it or anything, but just for your own knowledge. I'm going to be touching on some of the stuff in this live tonight that's in that video, but not all of it. And it's just really to situate us as to why we need to be talking about schools and society. All right. So if we think about schools and we think about society, we jumping right into the heavy meat. This quote from James Anderson, where he talks about education of blacks in the South from 1865 to, I forget, sometime in the 20th century, but it says both schooling for democratic citizenship and schooling for second-class citizenship have been basic traditions in American education. These opposing traditions were not, as some would explain, the difference between the mainstream of American education and some aberrations or isolated alternatives. Rather, both were fundamental American conceptions of society and progress, occupy at the same time and space, were fostered by the same governments, and were usually embraced by the same leaders. So, Dr. PW, why are you starting with this heavy quote? Well, because the function of schools in society, has not been accidental, and that's what we're going to take up a little bit this week. Schools, why are they here? Why do we have schools in America? Why are we sending our kids? Why is it mandatory for us to send our children to schools from the age of 5 to roughly 16? Is it so that we can have jobs? Is it so to keep kids out of trouble? Um, we're going to talk about that. But mostly what Dr. Anderson is talking about here is that schools serve a purpose. And he argues that the purpose of schools, as put forth by various levels of government, is to create two types of citizens, a first class citizen and a second class citizen, a ruling class and a servant class, if you will. So these are some of the critical questions that are going to lead the way that we think about this live today. Um, I want y'all to think about how has education been framed and who decides what are the parameters of education and what gets privilege. Um, these are some other readings. I might cut this part out because this is from another class that I taught. But basically, these are some readings where people make arguments about the purposes of education. If you took my other class, the philosophy of education, um, you know that we talk about, or at least we try to talk about the purposes of education. A lot of times today, people will be like, education is so you can get a job. But is that really the only purpose of education? And if you can't get a job, does that mean that education failed? Right? I know it's not very practical, but we are going to be looking at some philosophical um, framings of the purposes of education society. All right, so let's jump right into the history. And you're going to get into this in your video. When the schools were first started, you know, we're coming up on our anniversary. What is it? The semi-squasquennial of the United States, the semi-sesquicentennial of the United States, where we're officially a government. But before then, we did have forms of government and we had schools. And in the beginning times, in the colonial education from 1620 to 1770, the early emphasis, as you'll see in the video, was on religion and authority. But Dr. Perkins-Williams, what about the separation of church and state? That came way later. That was not an issue in the early schools. Um, in the early schools, the purposes of education was to help children to be morally sound. They studied the Bible in early education, and to respect the authority. Uh, Most people did not get an opportunity to learn to read, so it wasn't for everyone. It conferred and confirmed social status. If you had money and could afford to go to school, you would. But there were a couple of education policies. Um, the first one was, I want to go to, it's this old deluder Satan law. Uh, and I'm going to switch the stop sharing and I'm going to switch it to whatever just opened up. Okay. The old deluder Satan Act of 1647, when schools were first started, it says it's from the records of the governor and company of Massachusetts Bay in New England. And that's who took the records of it. It says, it being one chief project that the old deluder, Satan, to keep men from knowledge of the scriptures as in former times by keeping them in an unknown tongue, so as in these latter times by persuading from the use of tongues, that so that at least the true sense and meaning of the original might be clouded and corrupted with false glosses of saints seeming deceivers, and to that end, that learning may not be buried in the grave of our forefathers in church and commonwealth, the Lord assisting our endeavors. Okay, that's the first part. I have a better slide, and I might re-record this for the purpose of posting it. But that's the first part. And the second part says, it is therefore ordered that every township in this jurisdiction, after the Lord hath increased them to 50 households, shall forthwith appoint one with one town to teach all such children, and shall resort to him to read and write, whose wages shall be paid either by the parents or masters of such children, or by the inhabitants in general, by way of supply. As the major part of those that ordered the prudentials of the town shall appoint, provided that they send their children, be not oppressed by paying much more than they have them taught for in other towns. That's a lot of words. So what are they saying? This is the first law that mandates that children go to school. So as soon as there's 50 households in the town, you have to form a school. And then it goes on to say, like, if you don't, it's further ordered that when any town shall increase in the number to 100 families a household, they shall set up a grammar school, a whole school, the master thereof being able to instruct youths so far so they may be fitted for the university, provided that if any town neglect the performance hereof above 1 year, each town shall pay £5 to the next school um, till they shall perform this order. So what is this saying? There's a lot in here as well. It's saying like you will set up a school, you'll have a teacher if you get to 50 households. If you get to 100 households, you'll set up an actual school. And if you don't, you're going to be punished, right? So we see our first education policy and we see our first penalty, right, for not adhering to that education policy. So, and that was in 1642, and we see more of it today. I mean, 1647. In 1642, um, yes, here's another law. There's a lot of old English sharing. It says, for as much as the good education of children is a singular behoof and benefit to any commonwealth, and whereas many parents and masters are too indulgent and negligent in their duty in the kind, it is therefore ordered that the select men of every town and the several precincts and quarters where they dwell shall have a vigilant eye over their brethren and neighbors to see first that none of them shall suffer so much barbarism in any of their families as not to endeavor to teach by themselves or other their children and apprentices so much learning as may be enable them perfectly to read English tongue and knowledge of the capital laws upon penalty of 20 shilling for each neglect therein, right? So again, one of the oldest laws, you will teach these children, you will set up a school, or you will be financially penalized. There was other schooling in place. There was apprenticeships, there was grammar schools, there were day schools where kids learned how to read and write. You'll see that more in the video. And then there was the book, the New England Primer. You will definitely see it in the video. There's a link to it in the slides. I'm not going to show you now. Well, yeah, I'll show you now. So the New England Primer. Let's see what the New England Primer look like. This is just a Wikipedia page. So I'll just pull up just a video of it. So this is the first kind of like language book that students had. Um, and it said, and it had how they learned how to read and write in these primers. They learned their ABCs by connecting it to the Bible. A, in Adam's fall, we send all. B, the Bible. That thy life to mend, this book to attend. C, the cat doth play, and after slay. D, a dog will bite, a thief in the night. So as you can see, like the morality is deeply tied into it. Um, into like even teaching kids how to read and write. All right. And so this is kind of like what a dame school looked like. You'll see this in the video. And then the first college, like higher education, um, hold on. I think it was like Harvard. It's one of the oldest schools in the country. And this was before K-12. So who was going to college if there was no K-12 schools? Like the rich people were sending their children, mostly their sons. I don't think girls were able to go to school at this time. Definitely not Harvard. Okay. And what was the purposes of school? As we saw in those laws, citizenship and nation building. We weren't quite a nation yet, but there were certain type of people that we wanted to be in this nation. Build character, um, talked about faith and reach. But this is not in the early schools. This is kind of like a little bit later. This is not the colonial schools. This is more of oh, have mercy. This is like not quite progressive schools. I can't think of what it's called, but I'll find it and I'll post it. Um, so after the colonial schools, there came like this push for like nation building. Why? Because we were under the age of enlightenment, and those things influenced us. So that was like right around when America became. If y'all are historians and you want to like comment under anything I'm saying, feel free. I'm not a historian, but I do like history. I do like educational history. But this was during the time when, America was becoming a country and we were under the influence of liberal ideologies. What does that mean? Faith versus reason. Over in Europe, over in France, people were discovering like scientific method and science and all of these things. And so they started prefacing that above religious zeal. And then it talked about natural law instead of the law that came from heaven. It's like, what do we see in nature? Because people are going to exploring and observing. And Republican virtue, specific roles for women, specific roles for men, progress as opposed to barbarism. There's a lot of exploring in the world going on at this time, and the cultures that they encountered, were seen as backwards and barbaric, and they wanted the world to be progressive and moving forward. And there's beginning nascent nationalisms, breaking away from like colonialism, being a colony of the British Isles into its own separate nation, and freedom was very much so preached. Economic freedom, civic freedom, political freedom, intellectual freedom. Um, and then it became this radical idea of a public education. So in the early era of our country, Thomas Jefferson, he pushed forth classical liberalism. He was and he pushed for popular education, but not for everyone. If you saw Hamilton, which I'm a huge fan of Hamilton, some people fought for the enslaved people at that time to go to schools, but that wasn't something that they want, right? We want our freedom from the British Isles, and Thomas Jefferson wanted people to go to school, but not everybody, just like, the common people, so that we can keep our budding nation together. So there was education with limitations and educational idealism and political realism. Education wasn't for everyone. But if you earned it, right? So we already know from the others, what I just showed y'all, that people could go to school if they were like the sons of like rich landowners. But if you weren't, Thomas Jefferson kind of introduced this notion of merit where you could earn your way into education, which is kind of funny because that's what we think of education as being a meritocracy in general, and we think that's the way that it was from the beginning. And that is not the way it was from the beginning. Education was not for everyone. And then moving forward, we move into the Common School era. You can read any of these books, The Pillars of the Republic, Education for Extension, The Feminization of Teaching in New England. You're going to see kind of like what the Common School era looked like in the video. But as as towns and the nation began to grow, um, you know, people wanted schools. And this is a picture of American progress. And it's like one of the great symbols of American rugged individualism and American expansion and American progress. If we were meeting in person, I would ask you, what do you see? Like on this video, like what are the things that you see? You see how this person, I don't know who this goddess is, but like the Telegraph, she's leading the Telegraph because she's leading America to progress. And you see the wagons of the great pioneer folk moving westward. And then you see them driving out like the indigenous people. Like it is political. Everything was political in that American expansion wasn't just benign, it served a specific purpose. And you'll see when they talk about it in the video, what was the role of educators in that. So, as they're moving forward, there was, let me see if it's in another, Horseman. He was the greatest proponent of common schools. He's the one who was like, hey, we can't just have like people teaching everything all willy-nilly. We need to have schools that are the same for everyone, like common curriculum, common set of ages going, That's when we started thinking of like grouping kids by age. It used to be whoever could go to school went to school, and you got what you could get. You could be 5, you could be 15. Everybody was educated in the same room. And he wanted to organize it. And he literally went from town to town on horseback, preaching and extolling the virtues of common school. So, what is the context of common school? Why did we need common schools? Because there was demographic shifts. There was social reform and westward expansion that we just talked about. And then they talked about who should control the school, local versus state control. And then there was a push for more female teachers. Um, the common ideology of the time was Protestantism still. Um, and then there was the Whigs, which was a political party before the Democrats and the Republicans. There were the Whigs, and democratic localism, like people wanted to be able to control their own schools, and that was the context for which the common school ex for which common schools expanded. And I'm going to fix this slide before I post these, but there's three distinct features of common schools. One, that educating all kids in a common schoolhouse was important. I don't know if I have the rest of them. Oh, okay. So educating all kids in a common schoolhouse, even they have a different variety of religion or social class and ethnic backgrounds, that was not popular before the common school era, right? And there was a belief in Protestantism. So it didn't matter if you were Baptist or if you were Episcopalian, if you were Lutheran, under the common school, you could all go to the same school. I know that like we that's like common sense for today, but back then these were radical ideas. Like go to school with somebody of a different religion was really kind of wild. And that's Horace Mann, the father of the common school movement. And then the second thing about common schools is like using schools as an instrument of government policy. So the political arena, political theater that we see today happening in schools is not new. It's literally been happening since the beginning of schools, right? Someone's always trying to push a perspective or policy in schools and the purpose of schooling. So in the common school, there was an acceptance of the idea of a direct linkage between government and educational policies and solving social problems, controlling social issues, economic issues, and political issues. So common schools or schools in general were kind of seen as a panacea for societal ills. So what's the relationship between schools and societies? Apparently, we're supposed to save society, and the whole world is supposed to be fixed through teachers and the work that we do. Um, and also, with the push for common schools began the creation of state agencies to control local schools. So that's where you started getting your state schools of your state departments of education. Later on, we got our U.S. Department of Education, but it became more bureaucratic because we needed people to make sure that all of our rules and policies were being implemented. And Horseman's vision was to design schools as systems that were interconnected and push Enlightenment ideas again, not the religious ones, but those of Enlightenment. And he was influenced by the Prussian school system, which did things like grouping by age and things like that. And under him, also the feminization of teaching. And I don't want to spoil why there's more women teachers. That's in the video. So if you want to know why there's more women teachers today than male teachers, look in the video. I believe the last time I checked, the teaching force was from K through 12 was 80 some odd percent, 84% women. Okay. All right. So other things that they were fighting against and they wanted schools to solve, the threat of Catholicism. Back in the day, a long time ago, Catholics were not seen as just another faction of Christianity. They were seen as a whole separate faction from Christianity. And Protestants, if you know your history, were the people who moved away from Catholicism. So it was like Catholics and everybody else who was Christian. And so in the American schools, because of the immigration of Irish and other people from South and Eastern Europe, they wanted to make sure they had a common understanding of even the religious values of the United States. And so the only way they could ensure that was to make sure that they were learning these things kind of sort of in school. And then, when Horace Mann was pushing for um, the common school, enslaved people had just been freed. So what was going to happen to them? And they needed to be educated as well. But the schools were segregated. In the antebellum South, the state passed laws prior to this, during enslavement times. States had passed laws making it illegal to educate enslaved people, Black people, African people, and their descendants. But they had to repeal those laws after they lost the Civil War. The Confederacy lost the Civil War. So how are you going to educate them? So that was something that was taken up by Horace Mann with the common schools too. And then you have the indigenous people um, who were supposed to be civilized, right? So schools were places where indigenous folks could become civil human beings because apparently they weren't before they encountered the European settlers. So so education was for civilization or extinction. Those were the options. Get educated, die. And if you know anything about the Trail of Tears, where they were removed from their homelands and pushed to kind of like the Midwest. That's why Indiana is called Indiana. I don't know if this is true, but I heard it's because this was supposed to be the place in the country for all the indigenous folks to live. But it never really came to fruition. But you'll find a lot more indigenous folks and reservations and things like that, kind of like in the Midwest and the Plain States, because they were pushed out of places like Florida, Alabama, the places where they were, Virginia, New York, you know, when the settlers first got here. So we have these schools, we have these school districts, we have people, we have school systems, right? But we need somebody to run these schools and to run these districts. And this is where the principalship began. Prior to the common school era, there was not necessarily a principal. There might be a head of school, but there wasn't like a schoolhouse big enough that needed a principal to oversee multiple teachers because there was usually only one teacher. If there was two teachers, you might like have a head teacher and assistant teacher. But when we start expanding and growing our schools because of these common schools, you're going to need somebody to lead it, and that's the principal. So we went from these one-room schoolhouses to these multi-classroom structures. And okay, I'm sorry. My I'm gonna pause this for 1 second. I gotta do this thing really quickly. I'm gonna pause the recording.